So the only two times in American history when black folks got some freedom has been the last few decades in America, and also about 12 years right after the end of the Civil War. The only way they were able to retain the freedom at the end of the Civil War was when they had the armed guards. They had armed troops stationed in the South in the Confederacy. So they had armed guards. They had the Freedmen's Bureau, which was feeding and clothing and housing and redistributing the confiscated lands. And for 12 years, the occupation of the South had allowed black folks to actually stand up and get some freedom. That, and then fast forward to the 60s, you had a very strong nonviolent movement started by symbolized most by Martin Luther King Jr. Now, when that failed, when the civil rights movement had failed, then you get into the Black Power movement, which was saying, stand up for yourself. And so it just seems like the old adage that of I want to say Mao Zedong, that power comes out of a barrel of a gun. And so in the South you have the occupation that is protecting the black folks' rights. There's actually the picture which was sitting there showing what kind of bureau the Freedmen's Bureau was going to be, and so when the black person would go to vote, the Freedmen's Bureau agent was there to make sure that they were allowed to go vote. Now, what happens after this 12-year period, which is called the period of Reconstruction in America, it fails. It fails. Very similar to the 60s. Hunter S. Thompson said the 60s failed. So the Reconstruction failed because then black folks go into a segregated system. So you have a racial dictatorship. You have a totalitarian racial dictatorship, and you have de facto slavery, where they're having to be sharecroppers on the same land with the same owners that they had before. The company store would own them. Then you also had the acts of lawlessness of the Ku Klux Klan going around just hurting whoever they want to hurt. So when I look around, I see a bunch of Confederate flags. When I see the presidential elections, how it's very red in the South, you see that that basically it's the same thing. You see the same history is just repeating itself, and it's not getting better. Another continuation of that period to today is that we are living in the second Gilded Age. You see the big bankers, and you see the Wall Street executives. You see all the people making tons and tons of money, and the inequality across the board is getting wider and wider. The chasm or the schism between the have and the have-nots is continuing to widen. In fact, that's what Bernie Sanders is railing against, is the decline of the middle class. So the decline of the middle class is essentially just making it to where there's only two groups of folks. Those who are making tons and tons of money, cutting labor costs, and then the people that have to be just cheap labor, fighting amongst themselves in order to get themselves a decent wage. So Henry Highland Garnet was one of these abolitionists during the Reconstruction period. It says here he's born in Maryland, and then he dies in Monrovia, which is actually Liberia. So he's an African-American abolitionist, a minister, educator, and orator, an advocate of militant abolitionism. Garnet is a prominent member of the movement that led beyond moral suasion towards more political action. Renowned for his skills as a public speaker, he urged blacks to take action and claim their own destinies. For a period, he supported immigration of American free blacks to Mexico, Liberia, or the West Indies, but the American Civil War ended that effort. So he's born into slavery in Maryland, December 23rd, 1815. According to James McCune, which actually would have been yesterday, right? So this man was born yesterday, nearly 200 years ago. So I bet we will hear more about Henry H. Garnet next year, because that'll be the 200-year anniversary of his birth. So he's got a ministry. He says he studied theology, became a pastor of the Liberty Street Presbyterian Church, a position he held for 6 years. During this time, he published papers that combined both religious and abolitionist themes, closely identifying with the church Garnet supported the temperance movement and became a strong advocate of political anti-slavery. So his anti-slavery role, he basically goes around giving speeches, and he was just like Marcus Garvey, where he was sitting there, you know, the racists, the Confederates were sitting there saying, just ship them back to Africa, right? And that actually requires a lot of resources and time and effort. And he was jumping on board with this. So Henry Highland Garnet was like, yeah, hell yeah, send us over to Africa. Yes, go ahead, give us the money. We will go back there, and we won't have to deal with the same type of oppression. It'll be a different type of oppression, but let's do this. Lincoln actually had an experiment where he sent a lot of people to Haiti, and that experiment actually wound up failing like miserably, because when he went back, when they shipped it to Haiti, it was actually some con man who didn't own land, who didn't own the place, and it was a de facto plantation, or straight up was a plantation. It wasn't the guy's own land, and then it just ended up in such a horrible manner. Basically, Lincoln gave up on the idea of decolonization. Says the free labor movement invited him at Great Britain in 1850. He opposed slavery, but by rejecting the use of products produced by slave labor. He's a popular lecturer, spent 2.5 years lecturing. 1852, Garnet was sent to Kingston, Jamaica as a missionary. He spent 3 years there until his health forced him back to the United States. When the American Civil War started, his hopes for immigration as a solution for blacks ended. He worked to find black army units to aid the Union cause. In the 3-day New York draft riots of July 1863, mobs attacked blacks and black-owned buildings. So even in New York, right, you're seeing sort of a pushback, a lot of racism. So for Reconstruction to fail, that's not a big surprise. You had the Republican and the Democrat, Rutherford B. Hayes and something Tilden v. Hayes, who had made a compromise saying the election was too close to call, and so they made a compromise saying we will make the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes president as long as the occupation of the South is declared over. So because the Republicans got the power of the presidency, they lost the occupation of the South, and the liberal experiment of Abraham Lincoln fails. So, John Wilkes Booth, just like Rand Paul says, John Wilkes Booth essentially, stopped this great idea of Abraham Lincoln actually changing, American society for the better. For the better. I don't know anybody that actually agrees with slavery. I've never talked to anybody that says, oh yeah, slavery was a great idea. So I want to read Henry Garnet's Call to Rebellion. This is a speech that he made, I want to say after the Civil War, at some time during Reconstruction. No, before the Civil War. So this is 1843. And so essentially he's saying it's time for black folks to stand up. So this is before, this is during the time of slavery. And I think it's also important to remember that Harriet Tubman, she said that she could have rescued millions more had they known that they were slaves. So even real slavery on the plantations, people didn't realize that they were slaves. Real slavery was, they didn't realize that they had no rights or no freedom, and they had no, ability to be just men and women in their own capacities, which is frustrating. But I think there's a correlation till today, because we have wage slaves, where you rent your body out for so many hours in order to get a paycheck. And the argument in favor of slavery was that you take care of something you own better than something that you rent. So if you take care of something that you own better than something that you rent, therefore slavery, they, comparatively speaking, they said would be better, because you want to make sure the whole person was okay so they could keep on working. But if you just rent, right, you go to a job, you get your pay, you put in your hours, you get your paycheck, now get out of here. I don't care what you do with your money, how you live, what it is that you spend your time on. So here's the address. I'm just going to read this and then call it a night. So, an address to the slaves of the United States of America. Brethren and fellow citizens, your brethren of the North, East, and West have been accustomed to meet together in national conventions, to sympathize with each other, and to weep over your unhappy condition. In these meetings, we have addressed all classes of the free, but we will never until this time send a word of consolation advice to you. We've been contented in sitting still, mourning over your sorrows, earnestly hoping that before this day your sacred liberty would have been restored, but we have hoped in vain. Years have rolled on, and tens of thousands have been borne on streams of blood and tears to the shores of eternity. While you have been oppressed, we have also been partakers with you, nor can we be free while you are enslaved. We therefore write to you as being bound with you. Many of you are bound to us not only by the ties of common humanity, we are connected by the more tender relations of parents, wives, husbands, children, brothers, sisters, friends. As such, we most affectionately address you. Slavery has fixed a deep gulf between you and us, while it shuts us out from you the relief and consolation which your friends would willingly render. It affects and persecutes you with such a fierceness which we might not expect to see in the fiends of hell. But still the Almighty Father of mercies has left to us a glimmering ray of hope, which shines out like a lone star in a cloudy sky. Mankind are becoming wiser and better. The oppressor's power is fading, and you every day are becoming informed and more numerous. Your grievances, brethren, are many. We shall not attempt in this short address to present to the world all the dark catalogue of this nation's sins which have been committed upon an innocent people, nor is it indeed necessary for you to feel from day to day, and all the civilized world look upon them with amazement. 227 years ago, the first of our injured race were brought to the shores of America. They came not with glad spirits to select their homes in the new world. They came not with their own consent to find an unmolested enjoyment of the blessings of this fruitful soil. The first dealings they had with men calling themselves Christians exhibited to them the worst features of corrupt and sordid hearts, and convinced them that no cruelty too great, no villainy, no robbery too abhorrent for even enlightened men to perform when influenced by avarice and lust. It's greed. Neither did they come flying upon the wings of liberty to a land of freedom, but they came with broken hearts from their beloved native land and were doomed to unrequited toil and deep degradation. Nor did the evil of their bondage end at their emancipation by death. Succeeding generations inherited their chains, and millions have come from eternity and time and have returned again to the world of spirits, cursed and ruined by American slavery. The propagators of the system of their immediate ancestors very soon discovered its growing evil and its tremendous wickedness, and secret promises were made to destroy it. The gross inconsistency of a people holding slaves, who had themselves ferried over the wave for freedom's sake, was too apparent to be entirely overlooked. The voice of freedom cried, "Emancipate your slaves." Humanity supplicated with tears for the deliverance of the children of Africa. Wisdom urged her solemn plea. The bleeding captive plead his innocence and pointed to Christianity, who stood weeping at the cross. Jehovah frowned upon the nefarious institution, and thunderbolts, red with vengeance, struggled to leap forth to blast the guilty wretches who maintained it. But all was in vain. Slavery had stretched its dark wings of death over the land. The church stood silently by. The priest prophesied falsely, and the people loved to have it so. Its throne is established and now reigns triumphant. Nearly 3 million of your fellow citizens are prohibited by law and public opinion, which in this country is stronger than law, from reading the book of life. Your intellect has been destroyed as much as possible. In every ray of light they have attempted to shut out from your minds. The oppressors themselves have become involved in the ruin. They have become weak, sensual, and rapacious. They have cursed you. They have cursed themselves. They have cursed the earth which they have trod. The colonists threw the blame upon England. They said that the mother country entailed the evil upon them, and that they would rid themselves of it if they could. The world thought they were sincere, and the philanthropic pitied them. But time soon testified their sincerity. In a few years, the colonists grew strong and severed themselves from the British government. Their independence was declared, and they took their station among the sovereign powers of the earth. The Declaration was a glorious document. Sages admired it, and the patriotic of every nation reverenced the godlike sentiments which it contained. When the power of government returned to their hands, did they emancipate the slaves? No. They rather added new links to our chains. Were they ignorant of the principles of liberty? Certainly they were not. The sentiments of the revolutionary orders fell in burning eloquence upon their hearts, and with one voice they cried, "Liberty or death!" Oh, what a sentence that was that. It ran from the soul to soul like electric fire and nerved the arm of thousands to fight in the holy cause of freedom. Among the diversity of opinions that are entertained in regard to physical resistance, there are but a few found in gainsay that stern declaration. We are among those who do not. Slavery, how much misery is comprehended in that single word? What mind is there that does not shrink from its direful effects unless the image of God be obliterated from the soul? All cherish the love of liberty. The nice, disconcerting political economist does not regard the sacred right more than the untutored African who roams in the wilds of Congo, nor has the one more right to the full enjoyment of his freedom than the other. In every man's mind the good seeds of liberty are planted, and he who brings his fellow down so low as to make him contented with the condition of slavery commits the highest crime against God and man. Brethren, your oppressors aim to do this. They endeavor to make you as much like brutes as possible. When they have blinded the eyes of your mind, when they've embittered the sweet waters of life, then and not till then has American slavery done its perfect work. To such degradation it is sinful in the extreme for you to make voluntary submission. The divine commandments you are in duty bound to reverence and obey. If you do not obey them, you will surely meet with the displeasure of the Almighty. He requires you to love him supremely and your neighbors as yourself, to keep the Sabbath day holy, to search the scriptures, and to bring up your children with respect for his laws, and to worship no other God but him. But slavery sets all these at naught and hurls defiance in the face of Jehovah. The forlorn condition in which you are placed does not destroy your moral obligation to God. You're not certain of heaven because you suffer yourself to remain in a state of slavery where you cannot obey the commandments of the sovereign of the universe. If the ignorance of slavery is a passport to heaven, then it is a blessing and no curse, and you should rather desire its perpetuity than its abolition. God will not receive slavery nor ignorance, nor any other state of mind for love and obedience to him. Your condition does not absolve you from your moral obligation. The diabolical injustice by which your liberties are cloven down, neither God nor angels or just men command you to suffer for a single moment. Therefore is your solemn and imperative duty to use every means, both moral, intellectual, and physical, that promises success. If a band of heathen men should attempt to enslave a race of Christians and to place their children upon the influence of some false religion, surely heaven would frown upon the men who would not resist such aggression, even to death. If, on the other hand, a band of Christians should attempt to enslave a race of heathen men and to entail slavery upon them and to keep them in the heathenism in the midst of Christianity, the God of heaven would smile upon every effort which the injured might make to disenthrall themselves. Brethren, it is wrong for your lordly oppressors to keep you in slavery as it is for the man-thief to steal our ancestors from the coast of Africa. You should therefore now use the same manner of resistance as would have been just in our ancestors when the bloody footprints of the first remorseless soul thief was placed upon the shores of our fatherland. The humblest peasant is as free in the sight of God as the proudest monarch that ever swayed a scepter. Liberty is a spirit sent out from God, and like its great author, it is no respecter of persons. Brethren, the time has come when you must act for yourselves. It is an old and true saying that if hereditary bondsmen would be free, they must themselves strike the blow. You can plead your own cause and do the work of emancipation better than any others. The nations of the world are moving in the great cause of universal freedom, and some of them at least will, ere long, do you justice. The combined powers of Europe have placed their broad seal of disapprobation upon the African slave trade, but in the slave-holding parts of the United States, the trade is as brisk as ever. They buy and sell you as though you are brute beast. The North has done much. Her opinion of slavery in the abstract is known, but in regard to the South, we adopt the opinion of the New York evangelist. We have advanced so far that the cause apparently waits for a more effectual door to be thrown open than has been yet. We are about to point out that more effectual door. Look around you and behold the bosoms of your loving wives heaving with untold agonies. Hear the cries of your poor children. Remember the stripes your fathers bore. Think of the torture and disgrace of your noble mothers. Think of your wretched sisters' love and virtue and purity as they are driven into concubinage and are exposed to the unbridled lust of incarnate devils. Think of the undying glory that hangs around the ancient name of Africa, and forget not that you are native-born American citizens, and as such you are justly entitled to all the rights that are granted to the freest. Think how many tears you have poured out upon the soil which you have cultivated with unrequited toil and enriched with your blood. Then go to your lordly enslavers and tell them plainly that you are determined to be free. Appeal to their sense of justice and tell them they have no more right to oppress you than to enslave you. Entreat them to remove the grievous burdens which they have imposed upon you and to remunerate you for your labor. Promise them renewed diligence in the cultivation of the soil. If they will render to you an equivalent for your services, point them to the increase of happiness and prosperity in the British West Indies since the act of emancipation. Tell them in language which they cannot misunderstand of the exceeding sinfulness of slavery and of a future judgment and of the righteous retributions of an indignant God. Inform them that all you desire is freedom and that nothing else will suffice. Do this and forever after cease to toil for the heartless tyrants who give you no other reward but stripes and abuse. If they then commence the work of death, they and not you will be responsible for the consequences. You had better all die. Die immediately, then live slaves and entail your wretchedness upon your posterity. If you would be free in this generation, here is your only hope. However much you and all of us may desire it, there is not much hope of redemption without the shedding of blood. If you must bleed, let it all come at once rather than die as free men. And rather die free men than to live to be slaves. It is impossible, like the children of Israel, to make a grand exodus from the land of bondage. The pharaohs are all on both sides of the blood-red waters. You cannot move in mass to the dominions of the British Queen, nor can you pass through Florida and overrun Texas and at last find peace in Mexico. The propagators of American slavery are spending their blood and treasure that they may plant the black flag in the heart of Mexico and riot in the halls of the Montezumas. In the language of the Reverend Robert Hall when addressing the volunteers of Bristol who were rushing forth to repel the invasion of Napoleon who threatened to lay waste the fair homes of England, religion is too much interested in your behalf not to shed over you her most gracious influence. You will not be compelled to spend much time in order to become inured to hardships. From the first moment you breathe the air of heaven, you have been accustomed to nothing else but hardships. The heroes of the American Revolution were never put upon harder fare than a peck of corn and a few herrings per week. You have not become enervated by the luxuries of life. Your sternest energies have been beaten out upon the anvil of severe trial. Slavery has done this to make you subservient to its own purposes, but it has done more than this. It has prepared you for any emergency. If you receive good treatment, it is what you could hardly expect. If you meet with pain, sorrow, and even death, these are the common lot of slaves. Fellow men, patient sufferers, behold your dearest rights crushed to the earth. See your sons murdered and your wives, mothers, and sisters doomed to prostitution. In the name of the merciful God and by all that life is worth, let it no longer be debatable question whether it is better to choose liberty or death. In 1822, Denmark VZ of South Carolina formed a plan for the liberation of his fellow men. In the whole history of human efforts to overthrow slavery, a more complicated and tremendous plan was never formed. He was betrayed by the treachery of his own people and died a martyr to freedom. Many a brave hero fell, but history, faithful to her Most High, will transcribe his name on the same monument with Moses, Hampden, Tell, Bruce, and Wallace, to St. Louverture, Lafayette, and Washington. That tremendous movement shook the whole empire of slavery. The guilty soul thieves were overwhelmed with fear. As a matter of fact, that at the time and in consequence of the threatened revolution, the slave states talked strongly of emancipation, but they blew but one blast of the trumpet of freedom and then laid it aside. All these men became quiet. The slaveholders ceased to talk about emancipation. Now behold your condition today. Angels sigh over it, and humanity has long since exhausted her tears in weeping on your account. The patriotic Nathaniel Turner followed Denmark VZ. He was goaded to desperation by wrong and injustice, by despotism. His name has been recorded on the list of infamy, and future generations will remember him among the noble and brave. Next arose the immortal Joseph Sinkay, the hero of the Amistad. He was a native African, and by the help of God, he emancipated a whole shipload of his fellow men on the high seas. And he now sings of liberty on the sunny hills of Africa and beneath his native palm trees, where he hears the lion roar and feels himself as free as that king of the forest. Next arose Madison Washington, that bright star of freedom, and took his station in the constellation of true heroism. He was a slave on board the brig Creole of Richmond, bound to New Orleans, that great slave mart with 104 others. 19 stuck for liberty or death, but one life was taken, and the whole were emancipated, and the vessel was carried into Nassau, New Providence. Noble men, those who have fallen in freedom's conflict, their memories will be cherished by the true heart and the God-fearing in all future generations. Those who are living, their names are surrounded by a halo of glory. Brethren, arise, arise. Strike for your lives and liberties. Now is the day and the hour. Let every slave throughout the land do this, and the days of slavery are numbered. You cannot be more oppressed than you have been. You cannot suffer greater cruelties than you already have. Rather die freemen than live to be slaves. Remember that you are 4 millions. It is in your power so to torment the God-cursed slaveholders that they will be glad to let you go free if the scale was turned and black men were the masters and white men the slaves. Every destructive agent and element would be employed to lay the oppressor low. Danger and death would hang over the heads day and night. Yes, the tyrants would meet with plagues more terrible than those of Pharaoh. But you are a patient people. You act as though you are made for the special use of these devils. You act as though your daughters were born to pamper the lust of your masters and overseers. And worse than all, you tamely submit while your lords tear your wives from your embraces and defile them before your eyes. In the name of God, we ask you, are you men? Where is the blood of your fathers? Has it all run out of your veins? Awake, awake, millions of voices are calling you. Your dead fathers speak to you from their graves. Heaven, as with the voice of thunder, calls on you to arise from the dust. Let your motto be resistance, resistance, resistance. No oppressed people have ever secured their liberty without resistance. What kind of resistance you had better make, you must decide by the circumstances that surround you, and according to the suggestion of expediency. Brethren, adieu. Trust in the living God. Labor for the peace of the human race, and remember that you are 4 millions. August 21st, 1843. Nearly 18 years before the end of slavery. Henry Garnet, abolitionist, one of the founders of the Reconstruction period. A bright, shining moment when South Carolina had the majority of the Constitutional Convention. The Constitutional Convention, the majority of them were black people. And then in the legislature, the majority of the lower house was also black people. They had an arm of government for 12 years. And it was because of the occupation by the liberal Republicans of Lincoln's men. So, how is change going to happen? By obedience or resistance? Only resistance. Can you get any type of change or any type of freedom? Only by resistance. If you do not fight, you've already lost. So you may lose if you resist. But if you don't fight, you've already lost.